Friends, hello everyone. Live still on the line. My name is Alexander F. Safe. As always, don't forget all the useful links in the description. Subscribe to the channel, like it, and give it a thumbs up. You're like flies in automatically because who do we have? Dmitry Yakovina. And today in court, Dim, hello? Thank you so much for coming and taking the time for us mere mortals here to listen to your valuable information. So friends, your comments are already coming in 100%. Dim, here's the topic. I wanted to talk to you about it. People want to lose weight, many of them, right? And it's not always necessary. This is related to the season, summer, winter. Many people reduce their body fat percentage, so to speak, all year round. How should they train during a calorie deficit? A calorie deficit? Because there are different opinions about this. Should you, when in a calorie deficit, actually increase your training volume in order to, so to speak, boost your energy expenditure, for example, to burn more fat? Or should you reduce your training volume while in a calorie deficit, so to speak? Well, because you have less energy and strength, you feel sluggish and down just walking around. Or, for example, switch entirely to circuit training. Should you change your training plan in terms of adding things like drop sets, supersets, increasing the number of reps? Because as we know, 15 to 20 reps is for definition. So, what does science say about this issue? And the most important question, let me ask you right away, do you even need strength training at all? Is it even possible to gain anything while in a calorie deficit?
So, based on the last question, strength training, is it possible to build muscle with it? What does strength training mean for us? It's a way to build muscle mass. That's their main purpose. I think that many people come to the gym for a variety of reasons and do strength exercises not so much to lose weight, although many hope that as a bonus, they'll also lose weight. But still, in order to truly and effectively increase certain specific muscle groups, it is important to focus on targeted exercises. And in fact, the biggest and most significant effect that we can get from consistent strength training is, first and foremost, an increase in the overall functional capabilities and performance of the muscles. That means an increase in strength, some specific strength endurance, and most importantly, size. And for many people,
For many, size is an issue, yes.
It's not so much about strength, not so much about how much you can bench press, but rather about a certain external aesthetic that would be noticeable to others or to the person themselves when they look in the mirror. So we have to admit that we train primarily for the beauty of the body. A smaller portion trains for athletic performance. And so, based on this, how reasonable or justifiable is it to use strength training, which by its very definition is, well, the most effective and powerful tool for impacting and influencing the muscular system in terms of developing hypertrophy, as well as serving as a means of burning fat. Ne? And this is what I'm getting at. It's important to understand that any developmental load is accompanied by a certain degree of negative impact on the muscular system. It is this negative impact that encourages the muscles to respond to the load by further increasing their overall mass. If there are no such indicators, again, the same hypertrophy, the muscle simply cannot develop. A light workout that doesn't interfere with the serious biochemistry and mechanics of muscle activity cannot promote the development of the muscular system. In other words, a developmental workout in bodybuilding is, in fact, almost always accompanied by certain muscle damage, specifically micromuscle damage, both to the proteins that we refer to as functional proteins, which are responsible for muscle contraction, such as myofibrils, and to those proteins that are responsible for the energy supply of muscle activity, the proteins contained in the sarcoplasm. A developmental workout aimed at increasing muscle mass inevitably damages all of these components. And together, this leads to an increase in our muscle volume. Accordingly, the greater the training volume, the greater the degree of muscle damage. We also know that there is an optimal training volume that provides the necessary degree of muscle growth without having an excessive destructive effect. Otherwise, we would just be training for the sake of training. No one does 100 sets for a muscle group in a single workout, or even within a week. Just think how many years bodybuilding has been around, and when there was an understanding of training volume, when we understand what benchmarks we have. And even back when there was no understanding at all, at least through empirical practical experience, athletes discovered for themselves that there is no such thing as the more, the better.
Smayev does it.
Maybe,
The kitty is waiting.
maybe. Different load protocols are needed there. So there is still some kind of optimum. One that gives the maximum result with minimal negative effects. And so when an athlete specifically trains for the purpose of increasing muscle mass and eats in a way that matches those workouts, meaning their nutrition provides the necessary level of recovery, energy, and building material. Plus, adequate nutrition at the very least also helps to significantly minimize the level of stress in the body. Even a slight energy deficit is a heightened source of stress. There aren't enough nutrients, especially energy, and our body is forced to get the necessary energy components from its own resources. And to do this, it uses stress hormones: cortisol, adrenaline, noradrenaline, glucagon. That's why any deficit is typically accompanied by a gradual increase in stress hormone levels, which are necessary to help mobilize energy from the body's internal reserves. When gaining muscle mass, we eat in such a way that the only stress we experience is the stress caused by physical exercise. In other words, minimum stress, maximum nutrients. Therefore, the likelihood of proper recovery and proper progress is at its highest. When reducing body fat, we are often forced to limit or restrict the overall amount of nutrients. Maybe protein, sometimes we might increase it, but we reduce the amount of energy substrates. Why? To enable our body, with the help of stress hormones, to effectively tap into our internal reserves and ensure their continuous maintenance. All bodily processes are supported by internal reserves, which leads to their reduction in quantity. So, when there is a deficit created by diet or exercise, the amount of nutrients coming from outside must, in any case, be insufficient. Accordingly, along with the reduction in energy intake, which we achieved by decreasing our food intake, by reducing our diet, we also get somewhat fewer vitamins, minerals, dietary fibers, polyphenols, and other components that are necessary not only for muscle recovery, but also, for example, for the functioning of the immune system, for the recovery of the joint and ligament apparatus, and for quality falling asleep and good sleep. That's why whenever we eat less, we not only get a lack of energy, which is what we want, but also other deficiencies. Without an energy deficit, we won't be able to reduce fat mass. But we also develop potential deficiencies of other substances that can affect the functioning of the body. In some indirect areas, it is important to understand that the very phase of reducing body fat, while it may seem beneficial, cannot in any way be considered fully adequate or sufficient for supporting all the needs and requirements of our physical training. If a person wants an energy deficit, and for the stage of energy deficit to be sufficiently adequate for physical activity, in fact, they should actually reduce their training load to balance it out. Like if you eat less, it means you should also train less. In this case, your body should train less. Should train less. Yes, Sanya, thanks for correcting me. Then in this case, everything will be adequate. But the thing is, your muscles don't care whether you eat a little or a lot. In order to create the proper and necessary stimulus for muscle hypertrophy, your workouts need to consistently remain as productive and effective as possible. That is, at the very least, both the intensity and the volume of your training should be maintained. Reducing training volume on the one hand ensures that the energy expenditure is adequate, but on the other hand, it doesn't provide the necessary stimulus for development. Therefore, by slightly decreasing the overall training volume during periods of fat loss, we are able to minimize the amount of stress that our body experiences. However, as a result, we will lose some muscle mass. Yeah. Training, whether it is during muscle gain or during weight loss, really serves only one main purpose. That is, it is either for muscle growth or for the maintenance of muscle mass. Therefore, reducing this stimulus leads to a decrease in the effectiveness of strength training. What do we know for sure and certain? What does modern science studying this say? What brought you results during the muscle building phase? It should be maintained at the very least. You shouldn't weaken your training stimulus by reducing your overall training volume, your training intensity, or anything else in any way like that.
While on a diet?
Yes, while on a diet, but
Then how do you train properly? How do you do a full workout? That same training volume I had when I was bulking? I'm currently in a calorie deficit, but in order not to lose any muscle mass, I have to at least maintain that same training volume. But how am I supposed to train effectively if I have to walk around all day like a sad sack of crap?
that's a good question. Absolutely the right question. How do you train just as hard as you did when you were bulking, but during a period when your stress levels are high? And again, this stress is primarily due to the deficit. A nutrient deficit definitely means there is an additional level of stress hormones present in the body. An energy deficit is typically accompanied by certain adaptive responses from our body to the lack of available energy. And what do they manifest as? In a decrease in the secretion and synthesis of certain neurotransmitters. These are related to motor activity and eating behavior. When we stay in a deficit for a long time, our body tries to adapt to it. How does it do that? By making us sluggish and lacking in energy. It stimulates our desire to eat even more food, feel significantly less full, and move much less than we normally would. This effect occurs both during workouts and also outside of training sessions. This is usually accompanied by a decrease in such hormones and neurotransmitters as serotonin, dopamine, adrenaline, noradrenaline, and orexin. So, during the process of losing weight, a person is not exactly, let's say, in fact, actually, hey, damn. Most often their mood is also not very positive. Moreover, since these same neurotransmitters are responsible for eating behavior, physical activity, and sleep quality, their decrease has a total impact on recovery processes. Getting a good night's sleep, falling asleep easily, and sleeping through the night without waking up on a diet is much harder than when bulking. And the reason for all this is precisely the changes in neurotransmitter function. Our body tries, through a series of physiological changes, to help you save every single calorie possible. Even positive emotions from the perspective of energy expenditure are considered bad by our body. Because a sad person is always a person who is slow. You know, a person in a bad mood even walks slower than someone in a normal mood. Your speed can decrease by 1 kilometer per hour. Instead of walking at 5, you walk at 4. It might seem like a small thing, but if you get around everywhere on foot, your total energy expenditure goes down. If a person is in a good mood, they fidget more. When they're sitting in a chair, they laugh more actively and often have more varied facial expressions and frequently gesture more.
If your friend doesn't even laugh at your gay jokes, it probably means that he's definitely on a strict diet.
Moreover, if your friend suddenly starts speaking very quietly and slowly in short phrases, which is another sign, and when you ask him to repeat what he just mumbled so unclearly through his teeth, then most likely he'll start swearing at you. He'll say, "I'm fucking tired of you asking me again and again." And all of this is connected to an energy deficit. But the point I'm making is this. The whole body during weight loss is under maximum stress and recovers as poorly as possible. And how do we deal with this? How can you train hard with all this?
Gram of displastiron.
I don't think it will help. For example, by the way, it's banal. For everyone, without exception, it begins to gradually decline. Libido. And many people take testosterone during this period, but their libido still decreases. Because testosterone is not the only hormone responsible for attraction to the opposite sex. You can't do without dopamine here. Dopamine is the motivation hormone. It's the hormone that essentially drives our desire for any action or behavior that brings us pleasure. But we don't supplement dopamine. There's testosterone. There is. But dopamine is suppressed simply by the fact of an energy deficit. So here's the thing. What does modern science tell us? First of all, basic exercises are always a priority when losing weight. But which basic exercises? There is a certain difference. For example, basic exercises that are performed with free weights are generally much more energy consuming. They require a greater concentration of effort and focus to perform them correctly, because with free weights we have to at least keep our torso stable in several planes, in addition to actually contracting and relaxing the muscles during an exercise. We also need to carefully stabilize and maintain our posture. We need to hold ourselves, for example, in a vertical position, standing so as not to lean or lose balance. At first, when the energy deficit is just beginning to take hold, it often feels as though nothing significant or noticeable is really happening to us at all. Our strength levels don't change. You might even be able to successfully demonstrate some of your strength numbers, working with maximal or near maximal weights, especially during the first part of your diet. However, as more time passes since you started the diet, and as you continue to lose more fat mass, you may begin to notice that exercises like squats, classic deadlifts, barbell rows, pull-ups, or push-ups, which may have previously felt manageable, gradually start to feel more challenging and require more effort to perform at the same level as before. With any weight on the bars, suddenly become harder for you. It's not just harder in terms of the amount of work you do, but it's also harder to make yourself do it at all. It's just a drag.
Yeah.
It's just really hard overall. You start warming up, and during the warm-up, you realize
That you're tired.
that you don't even want to move on to your working weight. You have to take the weight off, take a step or two back. So what does science say? Work in a way that maintains maximum efficiency. If you can't squat effectively because you don't feel well enough, then the exercise loses its effectiveness. You haven't gotten weaker, it's just harder for you to perform it with good quality. In that case, look for an alternative. An alternative in those exercises that are easier to perform. And that's the case most of the time. Machines. Machines, first of all, fix the position of your torso. Machines are generally designed so that you really don't have to think about maintaining your balance. You just extend and flex your limbs as needed. If we're specifically talking about free weight squats performed with a barbell, and also squats done in the so-called squat machines, where you get under the platform and simply hold on with your hands for support. There, all you do is sit down and stand up, up, down. You don't have to worry about getting crushed by the weight. You don't need to control the position of your torso relative to your pelvis.
But it will be as effective, right?
Yes. The load on the target muscle groups, those are the hip extensors, the glutes, the big muscles, won't change. But performing it in a state of energy deficit will be easier. So, the same intensity. Well, the weights will be a bit different since these exercises aren't exactly equivalent. Nevertheless, your overall actual strength performance on machine exercises will decrease much less than your real performance in exercises with free weights. But if this is relevant for a particular person, if they notice that their performance in basic free weight exercises is starting to drop significantly, then look for an approximately or somewhat biomechanically acceptable alternative in the form of machines.
What if I was already training on machines?
If we compare compound multi-joint exercises with isolation exercises, the latter will definitely be somewhat less challenging to perform. I think, for example, some dumbbell raises as exercises for the deltoid muscles will always be easier than a pressing exercise. Because a pressing exercise, yes, is performed by a group of various engaged muscle groups. At the very least, these are the forearm extensor muscles, the triceps, and the upper part of the trapezius muscles. Therefore, if you can't work fully and effectively in basic exercises on machines, then we switch to isolation work and we perform exercises that require in which only one joint is working. But of course, the difficulty here is that the total number of such exercises will increase.
In order to achieve the same volume.
To reach the same volume, of course, these are just a few, and there are certainly some drawbacks. But the general approach is as follows. We move gradually from heavier to lighter exercises. However, we must not forget to consistently maintain the training volume for the chosen muscle group. And here the difference is always obvious. What is an advantage for some exercises and a disadvantage for others can actually at times switch places during the fat loss phase. When someone is just starting out at the gym, we usually recommend compound multi-joint exercises with free weights. In other words, we are training the person to become an athlete, teaching them to handle heavy loads. But when someone has been on a diet for a long time, It's not the most suitable time right now to work on endurance or develop other skills. So it's better to focus on what you do best.
How appropriate or beneficial would it be during strength training while in a calorie deficit to switch to other training principles? For example, drop sets, supersets, strip sets, circuit training, or increasing the number of repetitions. So for instance, doing 6 to 8 repetitions. With this, well, when in a calorie surplus, it will be easier to do 6 to 8 reps than in a deficit. Calories, for example, increasing the number of reps per set, but also performing them effectively.
Look, here's an important nuance. What do we know about training modes during muscle mass gain? So in fact, at this point, modern science, which is already quite extensive, has accumulated enough research to tell us that we can train equally effectively both in a low rep range, like 5 to 6, and in a high one, like 20 to 25. You should choose based on what works best for you personally. For some people, doing 15 to 20 reps is unbearable and really hard. For example, they might have a relatively low neural capacity, so they tend to get out of breath and generally tire out faster than their muscles actually do. And for others, attempting to do 5 to 6 repetitions always leads to some form of cheating and losing control over the exercise. In other words, they do the exercise using whatever means they can, and for them, this kind of training load is ultimately ineffective. And so, these are the two extremes. The middle ground is, say, 8 to 12 reps. That's what usually works best for most people. Why is that? Because it's not particularly heavy and allows you to carefully control your technique. It helps minimize the load on your joints. And it's not as long and exhausting as, say, doing 15 to 20 reps. So from the perspective of the specific training mode we're creating, the type of load we're experiencing, when we're aiming to reduce body fat, this moderate approach is actually, well, not the absolute best, but generally the most optimal in most cases. Heavy loads, meaning those that require high intensity for 5 to 6 reps, become especially critical in the sense that they significantly increase the risk of injury. A potential deficiency of certain essential nutrients can, in many cases, lead to reduced tissue elasticity and also slow down their recovery rate. And when we have an energy deficit, all protein tissues in the body function in two directions. Protein synthesis decreases, while at the same time, protein breakdown increases. This applies not only to muscle cells, but also to structural proteins. Fascia, tendons, cartilage tissues, they grow less and break down faster. That's why the risk of injury is higher during periods of fat loss. So if you can't control your weight, there's a chance that overload or some technical mistake, which can lead to excessive strain on a certain area and increase the risk of injury. When we talk about working in the 15 to 20 rep range, it's important to understand that first of all, for many people, truly pushing themselves for 15 to 20 reps is quite challenging. It's hard even during a muscle building phase. For example, doing 20 squats to failure, even when you're eating well, requires a certain amount of willpower. So why on earth did you suddenly decide that during a fat loss phase, you'll be able to handle this routine that you couldn't manage before and not just go through the motions, but actually do it effectively? You can take a weight that is 50% of your max and do it for 15 to 20 reps. I think you can always do that, even when you're starving, but to do it effectively, if you couldn't do it before, you won't be able to now either. That's why sports science often emphasizes that this moderate approach generally suits most people. It's not too traumatic or overwhelming. And it's not too exhausting either. And the second point is especially important in terms of the conditions under which training takes place during weight loss. Fatigue will typically prevent us from training to our full potential during a period of energy deficit. That's why 8 to 12 is optimal for most people. But again, you need to understand, if someone has always done well, if they've always managed 5 to 6 reps and even 8 to 12 is too much for them, well, probably. And during weight loss, it's generally much better not to experiment or try new things. When we talk about different methods to increase the duration of the load, we mean not by simply increasing the number of repetitions, but rather by using various different techniques and approaches. For example, strip sets or drop sets. Or for instance, a compound set, when we perform 2 exercises for the same muscle group in a row. Or the rest pause method. All such techniques have their place with the goal of increasing the training volume, including effective load in less time. We can use the rest, pause, and strip set methods. And what does this give us? From the perspective, for example, of muscle impact, our workouts can become shorter in duration. They won't become more effective because every workout has a certain volume, an optimal volume beyond which you can't go. For example, if you did 10 full sets and your muscles responded to them by creating certain biochemical changes that will later lead to hypertrophy, then the 11th set, the 12th set, they won't make the system any better. But if, for example, you don't have time to do those 10 sets, you come to the gym and you only have 35 minutes, realistically, you can do, say, 5 or 6 sets, but by increasing their duration using these kinds of methods. A complex set, a strip set, and rest pause. And the scientific studies and research investigations that have been conducted and completed up to the present moment show us quite clearly that this can actually be effective in practice. Specifically, not in terms of increasing the overall stimulus, but in achieving the optimal stimulus in a shorter period of time. You come in and split your program into 2 parts. But you supplement each set, for example, with 1 or 2 sets using the rest-pause method. For example, you do a bench press. Rest for 20 seconds, then do a couple more reps. Rest for 20 seconds, then do 1 or 2 more reps. And in this particular case, of course, you might need a bit more rest time between your sets in order to recover effectively. But overall, you'll still complete all 5 sets with the added rest pause intervals faster than you would usually finish them. And in this way, with artificially limited training time, you'll achieve the optimal volume. And now, here's the thing. Do we need this during a weight loss phase? We need it for the same reasons as during a muscle building phase. If you come to a workout session and find yourself short on time, especially during a weight loss phase, you can choose to do this approach, which allows you to reach the necessary training stimulus much faster. But this actually has nothing to do with burning fat. No matter what you might have heard, you'll end up expending the same amount of energy as if you did 10 full sets, regardless of how long you rest between them. In other words, limiting the rest time between sets really doesn't matter when it comes to energy expenditure. It simply does not increase the amount of energy you spend in any way, nor does it have any special effect on fat burning. And you can do your 10 sets in an hour, or you can do them in half an hour. The amount of energy spent will equal the amount of work done. That's the weight, the number of sets, the number of reps, but not the rest time between them. Of course, you'll definitely feel a bit different, though. If you rest less between sets, you'll accumulate more toxins and fatigue, apparently in the form of hydrogen ions, ammonia, and so on. Accordingly, your body doesn't have time to process them, and you end up walking around all the time, feeling down and tired. Well, a lot of people like that. Many people like going home feeling exhausted. They think that if you're tired, it means you had a proper workout.
For example, used to train like a moose during bulking for an hour and a half, figuratively speaking, right? I've been on a calorie deficit for a month and a half, almost 2 months now. It's a pretty significant deficit already. And for the last half hour, I keep working at the same volume, but I just can't keep up. What should I do?
That's a great question. Really great. Here's another recommendation. Split your workouts into distinct, manageable parts. This is actually one of the most common, as well as one of the most effective ways to help maintain your overall performance over time. Even during a dedicated bulking phase, we still observe this characteristic curve of both increasing benefit and workload. With each additional set that you perform, the overall hypertrophic stimulus, or the muscle building effect, continues to increase. Then it reaches a plateau. And this is not only due to the gradual depletion of internal resources that are produced in response to the physical load, but also because as fatigue slowly accumulates over time, each subsequent exercise, each following set for the same muscle group becomes noticeably less effective overall. The beginning of a workout is always more effective than the end. If you don't believe it, just swap the order of your exercises. What you used to do at the end, with a certain weight for a certain number of reps, next time, do it at the beginning instead. You'll see both your working weight and the number of repetitions increase. This is even more relevant during a fat loss phase, since overall fatigue and the feeling of perceived tiredness in response to training will increase because all neurotransmitters related to physical activity are suppressed. And from this, there comes one of the main pieces of advice or recommendations for organizing your training process. Specifically, during periods of fat loss, it is beneficial to increase your training frequency by splitting your standard workouts into smaller, more manageable parts. For example, let's say you used to train your chest and back once a week on Monday, and you did a total of 10 sets for your chest and another 10 sets for your back. And then while on a diet, you start to notice both of these things. In the last exercise, it's just not quite the same as it used to be. You can barely manage to get through it. And you don't even have any real sense of fullness. The pump and the weights are such that you constantly have to adjust them, lower them, just to manage to do at least a somewhat acceptable number of reps. In this case, here's what we do. We take the planned workout session and shift either 30% or 50% of it to another day. This way, you'll be doing the same total volume over the course of the week, but under more favorable conditions. Otherwise, you have one workout where the beginning is effective and the end is ineffective. In this case, by removing the end and moving it to another day, you'll have a workout made up of two effective beginnings. You're just starting to get tired, and your workout is already almost finished. In this scenario, the last exercises that you did on Monday when you were running on fumes will be performed much more effectively when you do them on a separate day. And of course, it's tough to split all muscle groups into parts and accordingly drastically increase the number of gym visits. Well, yeah. And here, what are we usually advised to do? The principle of priority? You choose the muscle groups that are most important to you, or the muscle groups that are the hardest to train. Because if you're training your biceps or triceps, you have to admit you get tired much less. You'll be less exhausted by the end of the workout than if you were training legs, for example. At least for those muscles where this is more relevant, either because they're lagging behind, or it's just really hard for you to train them at the end. Exactly. In these situations, we increase the frequency of the load while still keeping the total training volume the same. You simply take some of the exercises for your legs, glutes, and quads and move them to another day in your workout routine. But for example, if you notice that your arms or shoulders don't really suffer in terms of performance throughout the whole workout, you can keep those sessions at the same level. There, it might be enough to just change things up a bit without splitting the workouts into parts. Or for example, you can swap free weight exercises for machine exercises or cable exercises since they're easier to perform. And for those big compound workouts that involve large muscle groups, that's where this principle really applies. It's better to have two fresh starts than to have one start and finish completely exhausted.
For example, I did a lat pull down with 80 kilograms. 12 reps were effective. I was doing great. But during my diet, my working weight dropped. It went down to 50 kilograms. In the same exercise, but I still do the reps just as effectively. Would that be a downside if the stimulus is the same? I'm giving the same stimulus, just with a different working weight.
Yes, unfortunately, yes, that would be an indication. If you're truly certain that it's not general fatigue that's bothering you, but your inner, the internal changes that occur in the muscles, in this case, are a clear sign that something in the muscles is degrading. It's an 80-10 matter. The matter is 50.
But just as effective, I also refusal.
You need to understand that,
After all, they're expecting the same stimulus according to the principle.
so to say. Look, when we compare using heavy weights with a low number of repetitions to using light weights with a high number of repetitions, both approaches can actually be equally effective in their own ways. Why? Because with heavy weights, we simply can't do many repetitions. That is precisely why heavy weights quickly bring us to the conditions that are necessary for optimal muscle growth. Light weights by themselves, the load is small, let's say, so at the beginning of the exercise, the stimulus is practically not created. It is created when fatigue gradually builds up and you eventually reach that zone where you really feel like you're straining yourself. In other words, both low-intensity and high-intensity exercise can actually be equally effective when you are working very close to the point of failure. But now just imagine, these are two different modes. In one case, we have, say, 5 to 6 reps, and in the other, 15 to 20. But when you use a weight that you used to do for 15 to 20 reps and now do it for 5 to 6, it's no longer the same stimulus for your muscles. The kind that makes it grow. If under normal conditions your specific muscle groups could do, say, 100 kilograms for 15 to 20 repetitions, but now they can only do 5 to 6, the principle of overload will not be met. It feels hard for you right now in the conditions you're in. But for your muscles, it won't be that physiological stress that actually forces them to change. What exactly are you trying to stimulate? Are you trying to make them work the way they used to? So it feels hard, right here and now. But for your muscles, this weight isn't actually hard. Yes, it feels hard here too. Of course, you're pushing yourself to your limits, but you need to understand that the stimulus is created by a combination of the load's heaviness and its duration. And let's say, for example, the heaviness hasn't changed, the same weight, but the duration of the load has decreased. So what used to stimulate your muscles before, now will not be a stimulus anymore. Because 100 for 6 reps, as we mentioned, let's say you're starting your training from scratch. And 100 for 15 reps is also from scratch. But when you are well fed and satisfied with yourself, that's a completely different level of impact on the muscle group. It's hard for us mentally. You're doing it with good form straining through gritted teeth. But for your muscle system, this isn't new work. It's already done this before, 3 or 4 years ago. For your muscles, it's hard when you take 100 kilograms and manage to do 15 to 20 reps. So in this case, it could indicate a decrease in the functional capabilities of your muscles. And why can they decrease? Because of the breakdown of the corresponding proteins. So apparently, either you're simply not recovering enough between your workouts, or the rate of protein breakdown is actually exceeding the rate of protein synthesis. And as a result, you're regressing. You're experiencing a noticeable loss of muscle mass. Like, again, both contractile myofibrillar proteins and non-contractile ones. You simply become smaller over time. Sooner or later, this kind of change will inevitably happen to any athlete, regardless of their level or experience. It's just a matter of time, as well as the amount of body fat you have. The more fat you have stored in your body, the more your body is able to get the necessary energy specifically from that fat, rather than from other sources. As your body fat gradually decreases over time, the need for energy still remains, but the ability to get all the necessary energy from fat stores also decreases. You then have to use tissues that aren't directly meant for this purpose, specifically your muscles. And that's why we become weaker. You said that, for example, when in a calorie deficit, deliberately reducing the amount of training load is not, yes, it's not rational. There are studies that show a greater loss of muscle when the training load is reduced. That's why, at the very least, you should maintain the same training volume to preserve muscle mass, trying to do it even when it's really hard. All right. Then what's the point of busting your ass in the gym on a calorie deficit doing strength training if the best we can do is just maintain our muscle mass? What about the recomposition effect? Can we actually build muscle while in a deficit? Or is all of this just a bunch of fairy tales? Actually, in principle, we can. Well, the muscle's physiological response to load is specifically triggered by the training stimulus. It's triggered by the load itself. Muscles grow because you train them, not because you eat a lot or a little. Nutrition is secondary. If there is a stimulus or trigger that forces the muscles in your body to change, they will generally try to gain the necessary and appropriate amount of muscle growth in order to match the specific degree of load that is being applied to them. But in one case, you eat in a way that optimizes this result. That is, you give your muscles exactly what they need, both in terms of energy and building material. When you reduce your calorie intake, what is the maximum your muscles can do to get the necessary amount of protein? And we increase this protein in our diet, but we reduce the amount of fats and carbohydrates. And the muscles still won't be able to get the required amount of energy, even from internal reserves. Why? Because mobilizing energy from glycogen, which, by the way, will be lower in any case, and from fat, requires the involvement of stress hormones. One of these hormones, cortisol, is very effective at getting energy by breaking down muscle tissue. So if you force your muscles to grow through physical exercise but don't give them enough energy, they take energy from internal resources. To make muscles grow, it destroys muscles. Yes, but only when there isn't enough energy coming from outside. I'm in a deficit. Well, how can you grow them? The recomposition effect. Look, there is removal. It would be truly great if during a calorie deficit, our muscles could actually get all the energy they need from their own internal reserves without any issues. In that case, an athlete in an energy deficit would keep progressing just like when gaining muscle mass. But because in order to get the necessary amount of energy, he also loses some of his muscle. The overall gain or the overall bonus that we receive from growth is significantly reduced. On a diet that is characterized by an energy deficit, we can still experience growth, but this growth happens on a much smaller and more limited scale than what would occur under conditions of an energy surplus. And here's the thing. You really need to understand that the rate at which people actually grow from training isn't always such that we can easily notice this growth within just a month. But for us, who grows quickly? Either beginners or beginners on steroid therapy. And even then, that is, people who, for example, start using pharmacology, they don't grow consistently and evenly over time at the same rate for 5 years. Otherwise, you could, if, for example, you gained a kilogram in your first month on gear, that doesn't mean that in 60 months, that's 5 years, you'll gain 60 kilograms. Sometimes you might gain 10. Over that same period, and even then, part of that weight will be water and fat. So, and
Unfortunate.
yeah, it's definitely unfortunate. The more muscle mass you are able to gain within a limited period of time, the higher the chance that you'll actually notice some degree of recomposition when you restrict your energy intake. So, for example, you could have gained, here are your capabilities. You're a beginner, maybe you're also on gear, or maybe you're just a beginner without any gear. Let's say you could have gained 3 kilograms of muscle with optimal nutrition, when you're getting everything you need from outside sources, but you decided to go on a diet. In this case, the rate of protein synthesis will decrease. The rate of protein breakdown will increase. The results won't be zero. They'll just be lower. And instead of gaining 3 kilograms in a month, 1.5 kilograms of muscle. But at the same time, you'll lose some fat. So if you've just started going to the gym, if you're overweight, you can immediately start a calorie deficit diet, which means consuming fewer calories than your body needs, and at the same time, you can work on building muscle and reducing your overall fat mass. However, your muscle growth during this period won't be as rapid or as significant as it would be if you were in a calorie surplus. But if you're an experienced athlete, if you have many years of training behind you, including experience with pharmacology, then why do you suddenly think that in just 1 to 2 months of losing weight, you'll notice any body recomposition? You barely changed at all while bulking. I mean, maybe you gained 200 grams of muscle in a year. By the way, that can happen. Many of us have trained for years and our weight stays about the same. Then you diet and say, I'm expecting recomposition. Come on, man, you had nothing happening while bulking. Maybe only your fat was increasing. And now, all of a sudden, you think recomposition will happen? So, if you weren't making strength gains for some objective reasons before cutting, you won't make them after either. You won't grow after cutting either. If you're still able to grow thanks to your genetics, or because you haven't been training for too long and haven't reached your genetic ceiling yet, then you really can notice the effect of recomposition. Losing fat, you build muscle, but the muscles will just grow in less than optimal conditions with less result. That is, most people who are already experienced, both in training and in pharmacology, at least not right away. Again, I'll repeat this important point. The less fat we have stored in our body, the harder it becomes for us to get enough energy. But maybe for the first 2 to 3 weeks, you'll still notice that your workouts are going well, and maybe you'll even see some progress. After that, the rate of progress will slow down and keep slowing down. According to the degree of deficit and the amount of fat left. That's why it will be impossible to notice real muscle growth progress in yourself. But of course, many people will confuse this progress with external improvements, because no matter what you say, a lean person always looks more defined and bigger. I've noticed it myself many times when people ask me, did you bulk up? I
just lost weight and
I was actually on a cut for about a month and a half at that particular time. I have to say, that's a really good question. I do lose weight.
by 5 kilograms and gained 9. No, I just lost weight.
Naturally, we can also see this as a kind of recomposition. So what actually happened here? You definitely didn't lose anything, because at the very least you didn't shrink, but because of the added definition and detail, you look more impressive. So people think you've gotten bigger, even though your body weight on the scale has gone down. So basically, recomposition is possible for those who are still able to grow. People with excess body weight, beginners, and those new to steroid cycles. All of them have more opportunities to get energy from outside sources, and their muscles grow fast enough that you'll definitely notice it. Growth happens even when the conditions aren't optimal for it.
That's actually really frustrating. You've been working out for 30 years and 3 more. You're full of experience. You know all the ins and outs of the gym, but your progress is next to nothing. Meanwhile, many eager beginners are putting on 10 kilos in the spring. You've already truly reached enlightenment. Your third eye has already opened. You know everything about the gym, so to speak, about nutrition too, but you're still gaining.
If it weren't for these limitations, everyone would really bulk up to that level, to the point where your physiology would just start getting in the way of your functioning. We all hit a ceiling. No matter the circumstances, even with the best nutrition and training, and with some kind of super-duper pharmacology, if there were no ceiling, people could, like those synthol freaks, where the muscles would just hang, and a person would barely be able to move, dragging around their incredibly massive muscle mass. Apparently, evolution simply didn't allow us to have such extraordinary capabilities. Because from the perspective of human survival and the preservation of the species, well, there are really no conditions where such enormous muscle mass would actually allow a person to survive better than others.
To run fast.
Fast, yes. And to walk for a very, very long time to find a handful of nuts and berries. The kind of food people ate when they were gatherers.
Friends, so is it clear to everyone now how to work out while in a calorie deficit? Don't go easy on yourself. At the very least, keep up the intensity. And the life hacks, the subtle nuances, such as how to choose and maintain the training volume you had before the diet, were, as always, very informative and helpful. Thank you very much for this wonderful and insightful explanation, friends. Leave your comments. Were you able to both lose weight and gain muscle? Or maybe, in some miraculous way, maintain your muscle mass while on a diet? Which of the principles Dima talked about have you already tried yourself, and were they effective? As always, all useful links are in the description. Subscribe to the channel. This was Living Steel. Bye.